An Old Testament reading from Exodus. Moses came down from Mount Sinai. He had come down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand. Moses did not know that the skin on his face shone because he had been talking with God. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke with them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face, but whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had commanded, the Israelites would see the face of Moses, that the skin of his face was shining, and Moses would put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with him.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the greatness of God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problem of 3 little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand. Those are the words of Rick in the film Casablanca. Rick utters these words on a rain-slicked tarmac at a small Moroccan airport. It's the climax of the film, and Rick, who's played by Humphrey Bogart, directs them towards his old love, Eliza Lund. Rick is helping Eliza and her husband escape to Portugal, where they will be safe from the Germans who have occupied Casablanca. And as Rick says his goodbye, Eliza's lips begin to quiver, and her eyes glisten with tears. The gravity of a hard goodbye has set in, and her head hangs. And Rick, in this moment, reaches out and touches the face of the woman that he loves, and he draws her back in, saying, Now. Here's looking at you, kid. One of the hardest things about life is learning how to say goodbye. Whether it's a friend moving away, a change in career, a child going to college, a pet passing, or the loss of a loved one. Isn't it just so hard to say goodbye? And this is partially why Peter ends up doing such peculiar things up on that mountain in Luke's gospel. On that mountain, Peter comes to grips with a hard goodbye, even while he looks the beauty of the moment in its teeth. Luke tells the story this way. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John up on a mountain to pray. And while Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face began to change, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. But Peter and the disciples, groggy from sleep, managed to catch a glimpse of Jesus' glory. And just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Then a mighty cloud came and it overshadowed them, and they were terrified. From the cloud came a voice saying, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Now, many people like to throw Peter under the bus in Luke's gospel. Peter comes off looking a little silly, and Luke certainly highlights his lack of understanding to his readers. As a narrator, Luke uses a delicate touch, or maybe a not-so-delicate touch, to indicate that Peter, quote, didn't know what he was talking about. Poor Peter. But you know, I have to tell you that I have some sympathy for Peter, and I suspect that maybe you will too. Peter is like us. He struggles to come to grips with the realities of departures. He struggles with imminent goodbyes. Like a cloud, the theme of departure hangs over the entire transfiguration story. Just before Peter, James, and John go up on that mountain, Jesus tells Peter and the disciples some very discouraging news. He tells them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and be killed. And Peter hears this before he goes up on the mountain. So it's no wonder why Peter, up on that mountain, with those words fresh in his mind, says, "Let's stay here. It's good for us to be here. I can build some dwellings. Let's just stay a little longer." Isn't it just so hard to let people go? Relationships are like monarch butterflies. When you're lucky to find them, you have to hold them lightly. Hold them lightly. If you hold on to butterflies too tightly, you will crush them. With people, it's the same. Hold them lightly. It's counterintuitive, I know, but in time, I trust you'll find that it's right to let them go. And yet these words will strike many as incomprehensible. Like Peter on the mountain, those who face significant departures find themselves left standing there, overshadowed by a cloud. And isn't this the real challenge with letting anything go? For those in the shadow of letting go, tomorrow becomes a cloud that you just cannot see through. And like Peter, it's terrifying to enter into the great unknown. But could there ever be a breakthrough in the clouds? As a church, we are people of hope. Could there ever be a release? Could there ever be a loosening of a grip and healing? Jackson Landers, a writer for the New York Times, found himself in an unenviable position. He was lying on his back, his teeth were clenched, and his hands were gripping the sides of the hospital bed. His knuckles were about as white as the lab coats which swirled around him. and the pain from his stomach cramps crept up towards his heart. 6 hours earlier, Jackson decided to go fishing at his favorite fishing hole near his home in Virginia. He grabbed his fishing tackle and his shoes off the front porch. And as Jackson put his shoes on, he began to walk down to the lake. He made it about a dozen steps before he started to feel a stinging sensation on the second toe of his left foot. But he just kept walking to the lake. But the pain started to increase. So Jackson sat down on a rock and he took his shoes off and he looked at his foot. And he found 2 small puncture wounds on his toe. And then he saw the squashed remains of a black widow spider smeared across the inside of the insole of his shoe. For a long moment, Jackson stared at his throbbing toe and he wondered what he'd do. Eventually, Jackson decided. He picked up his belongings and he went fishing. 3 catfish later, the symptoms were progressing. Jackson said he felt a warmth in his abdomen, and this warmth turned into pressure, which became a painful cramping. There could be no more denial. He carried his fish up the hill, loaded into the car, and headed for the hospital in Charlottesville. And that's how Jackson found himself lying there on his back with his teeth clenched and his hands gripping the sides of the hospital bed. The pain had crept into his chest, which was sending out waves of muscle spasms. His biceps were twitching and he shivered uncontrollably. At midnight, the mysterious antivenom was ready. It had been 6 hours since he was bitten, and the room was crowded with doctors, nurses, and medical students. The doctor injected the antivenom into his arm, and Jackson began to feel a warm sensation in his upper arm. What followed was what he described as, quote, the kind of rush that comes from a recreational drug. He said a wonderful warm flow spread from my left arm into my chest and then down into my abdomen. As time went by, Jackson's grip loosened, his spasms subsided, and his hands, they let go. For those in a cloud of loss, could there ever be a loosening of a grip? Could there ever be healing? Luke in his gospel says that Peter saw Moses and Elijah who appeared in glory, speaking with Jesus about his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. His departure, it's a curious phrase, and it's unique to Luke. It's not in Matthew's story, and it's not in Mark's, only Luke's. Now, Luke is speaking about the impending death and resurrection of Jesus, but he's speaking about something even deeper. Scholars like to point out that the Greek word for departure that Luke uses here is the Greek word exodon. Exodon, it's the same root word that is used to title the book of Exodus. Exodus, if you don't remember, is the title of the great book of the Bible that tells the wonderful story of the Hebrews leaving the slave pits of Egypt. The Exodus is a story of deliverance, of release. And Luke uses this word exodon, or departure, to describe the redemptive work of Christ that he will accomplish in Jerusalem. Just like in the book of Exodus, God is once again delivering his people out of sin and bondage and decay and creating a new people. This is how so many of the gospel writers understood the work of Jesus. For Luke, it wasn't just that Jesus died on the cross so that people could go to heaven. There was something deeper. In Jesus, Luke saw a new exodus unfolding. He saw that God was once again delivering his people out of sin and bondage and decay and creating new communities. Luke saw liberation, a great letting go. All of the gospel writers go out of their way to note that Jesus was crucified on or around the festival of Passover. Passover. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all timestamp the death of Jesus, not on the Day of Atonement, but on the festival of Passover. And Passover was the Hebrew religious feast which remembered and commemorated God's deliverance of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised to find that Luke here refers to the work of God during the transfiguration as a departure. It's a deliverance, an exodon, a release. Like in the Exodus of old, it's when people are leaving that we are witnessing the saving power of God. Perhaps there is no better illustration of this irony than a work by the modernist painter Marc Chagall. In 1966, Marc Chagall completed a surrealist painting titled Exodus. In his work, Chagall, a Jew, depicts a multitude of people fleeing Egypt behind Moses during the Exodus. In his painting, mothers walk through the darkness with nursing babies, and the men walk carrying all that they can. And Marc Chagall paints, surprisingly, the crucified Jesus hanging there above the multitude fleeing Egypt. It's the Exodus. It is in the act of leaving that Christ is beginning to do something new. Like the Exodus of old, when the clouds crowd in, it's when people are leaving that we are witnessing the saving power of God. What if you were to look at those who were leaving as people who were being delivered into the hands of God? What if you could see loss as God's gain? It's sad to be sure, but what if you could see your own tears transfigured? At the foot of the mountain, we find a man who meets Jesus, and he rushes up to him and he begs him, "Teacher, teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only child, my son." He shrieks and convulses, his muscles spasm, and he foams at the mouth. He says, "Teacher, I beg you, come look at my son." Luke includes this story of healing right after the transfiguration. And perhaps he does this because the two stories have a wonderful combined beauty. Don't you see? The one up on the mountain who's looked at in glory, he's the same one who comes down and he looks at those who are suffering. Praise be to God, the good Lord up on the mountain is the same good Lord who comes down and he looks at those who are hurting. Here's looking at you, kid. Here's looking at you.